Afternoon and welcome to Grand Rounds for today. Today we have a treat. Those of you that were able to grab some, we had some copies of Dr. Perry's book in the lounge for everyone. So today's presenter is Dr. Perry. Dr. Bruce Perry, over the last 30 years, has been an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and the neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. His work on the impact of abuse, neglect, and trauma on the developing brain has impacted clinical practice, programs, and policy across the world. Dr. Perry is the author with Maya Slasvich, of The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a best-selling book based on his work with maltreated children, and Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. Dr. Perry's most recent book, the one I just had in my hand, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing, was co-authored with Oprah Winfrey and released in 2021. The book was a New York Times #1 bestseller for 92 weeks on the bestseller list. It also won several awards, including Book of the Year. It's been translated into 33 languages, and 1.5 million copies have been sold worldwide. Dr. Perry has conducted both basic neuroscience and clinical research. His neuroscience research has examined the effects of prenatal drug exposure on brain development, the neurobiology of human neuropsychiatric disorders, the neuropsychology of traumatic life events, and basic mechanisms related to the development of neurotransmitter receptors in the brain. His clinical research and practice has focused on high-risk children. This work has examined the cognitive, behavioral, emotional, social, and psychological effects of neglect and trauma in children, adolescents, and adults. This work has been instrumental in describing how childhood experiences, including neglect and traumatic stress, change the biology of the brain and therefore the health of the child. He has published over 500 journal articles, book chapters, and scientific proceedings, and is a recipient of numerous professional awards and honors. He has served on the board of directors of multiple organizations, including Prevent Child Abuse America and the Anna Grace Project. And he is a native of, as you probably just heard him talking with Dr. Ellswick about, of Bismarck, North Dakota. He was an undergraduate at Stanford University and Amherst College, and attended medical and graduate school at Northwestern University, receiving both a MD and a PhD. He completed his residency in general psychiatry at Yale and a fellowship in child and adolescent psychology at and psychiatry at the University of Chicago. And today he will be presenting to us Introduction of the Neurosequential Model of Therapeutics. So please welcome Dr. Bruce Perry.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I always struggle when I have this opportunity. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you and share some of our work. And I always, I remember what it was like to go to Grand Rounds. I mean, sometimes it really was boring as hell, and you're like, oh my God, you kind of want to get paged so that you can just leave with a good reason. So I always struggle because I want to share things that will be stimulating, interesting, and I want to share them in a way that, kind of is engaging. So the way I like to do this is I basically try to tell the story of how our working group got to the point where it is right now in what we do. And, sometimes that it works and sometimes it doesn't. So first of all, I don't want you to panic, but I have like 3 different PowerPoint presentations that are open right now. Each one of them has like 500 slides. Don't worry, I'm not going to show them all. I'm certainly not going to read them all. But I want you to I think I should probably start by just saying that you've seen this slide up, and there are a couple of links here where you can get more information about the stuff that we're talking about. So any details or any articles or any videos, we actually have quite a few multimedia clips about different aspects of our work. So if you really are interested in any of this, you can, you know, go and visit some of these sites, and that's a good place to start. So let me start really here. This whole journey that we are on, and when I say we, I just want to make it clear that I'm just part of an interdisciplinary, multi-institutional work group. And we've been working together in different iterations for about 30 years. And in our community, ranges from people that are neuroscientists all the way to people that are interested in public health, public policy. We've got people that are in the corporate sector. We have people that are in focus on systems work in public systems. We have people who are educators, early childhood people, law enforcement. We're doing work with the federal courts. We're doing work. We're doing a work in a lot of arenas because, as all of you know, um, when individuals grow up and they experience chaos, threat, trauma, that influences their ability to learn. It influences their ability to function relationally, and that can sometimes spill over into interpersonal behaviors that become criminal or antisocial. And so all of these systems that we have, education, early childhood, sport, um, understanding developmental trauma and understanding how trauma influences the stress response systems, and then understanding how the stress response systems work in all of us, really is something that can be very helpful and important to be aware of. So that's a big part of what we've been doing is we've been working together to try to look at how developmental experiences, both good and bad, influence human beings. And we use a couple of different lenses. We use lenses that are kind of the neuroscience lens. We're moving into lenses that are less biologically focused, more sociology focused. And so the scope of our work is pretty broad. And that's kind of one of the challenges we have in trying to share it, is that it's there's a lot of junk and a lot of stuff that was potentially of interest to you. But I think one of the most interesting parts of our work is that some of it is, I don't want to say challenging, but some of it is going to be relevant for how psychiatry as a discipline evolves. And 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 I don't want to say that with any arrogance, like I'm involved in that. It's just that part of the reality we have is that when you're a psychiatrist and when you do mental health work, the organ you're dealing with is the brain. And you know, there are obviously, I don't want to be a complete reductionist about it, but let's just take that part of this. The brain is incredibly complex. And my development as a clinician was tremendously informed by my earlier development as a neuroscientist. I was a neuroscientist prior to becoming a psychiatrist. So when I came into psychiatric training, I had a PhD in neurobiology, and I actually had an active lab studying the development of the core regulatory networks that originated in the lower part of the brain, including the noradrenergic systems that originated in the locus coeruleus, and the dopaminergic systems and the serotonergic systems. And so a big part of my research was studying stress, the development of the stress response systems, the malleability of these stress response systems, the plasticity of these systems under different conditions. And one of the conditions that I focused on was early developmental disruptions. And so that research and that understanding of how neurons change, how they're very sensitive to environmental cues, how those systems play a role in appetite and in attention and locomotion and really all of the functions that animals have, including the human animal, was basically the matrix that I brought into my clinical training. And so part of the dilemma I had was, when I started to do my clinical work, I would see someone in front of me, and I would have, as we still do most of the time, have a weekly appointment, and it would be typically an hour long. And part of my brain kept saying, you know, that's just not that's not a dosing schedule that's meaningful to neurons in the brain. Neural networks don't change. That's not the most effective pattern of activation in neural networks that will lead to meaningful change. And I just kind of put that to the side for the longest time. And finally, after seeing person after person after person after person and feeling quite inadequate, um, I sat myself down and said, all right, what is my theory of change? What do I think I'm doing? When a kid who has years of abuse and neglect and trauma comes in and he's causing holy hell in the classroom and he gets sent to me in my little clinic at the University of Chicago, and I'm supposed to sit with him for an hour a week, and what am I supposed to do? And I thought, all right, well, I'll follow the rules. I'll pull up my little green book. Back then, I'm so old that the DSM was green the first time I used it. It was like the DSM-3. And so I'd kind of go through the little book and go, oh, wow, it's not this. It's a little bit of this. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that. And pretty soon I would end up like with a list of diagnoses. And all of you who are listening have had the experience of going through somebody's records and going, man, they've got like 40% of the DSM labels, at one point or another in their history. They've had 10 assessments, they've had 25 different diagnoses given, and nobody really understands them. And unfortunately, part of what we are trained to do as physicians is do something. And so what we learn to do is prescribe medication. So we end up with, 8-year-old kids that are on medication combinations like this, which we all know there's no evidence. I mean, when we talk about the research about, looking at efficacy of medications, et cetera, there's a light body of evidence for some medications used singly for certain disorders that are highly specifically identified, but the exclusion criteria remove all the kids that we work with every day. And so we've got this weird kind of cherry-picked body of evidence that's guiding all of our practice. And I don't say this in any way to be negative about our field. I'm just trying to point out what I think is kind of the reality. So I was looking at stuff like this and I kept saying, this doesn't make sense to me. And part of me was saying, all right, well, what do I know? What do I know about this? How do I make sense out of this? Here's what I know about the brain. I know we got 86 billion neurons. I know that we have twice as many glial cells, maybe not twice, maybe 1.5 times. There's people that spend their whole lives fighting about this. But there's a lot of them, billions. And then there's gazillions of synaptic connections, and there's hundreds of major neural networks that mediate thousands of functions, literally. But if you go into our public mental health clinics, 90% of our kids have some combination of 8 different labels. So you know that we're lumping people together. We're not discriminating. And prior to coming in to do my psychiatric training, I had been in a cardiac ICU for 3 months. And I knew that, the heart, I love the heart. Heart's a good organ, let's not discriminate. It's a good thing, love dub does a really good job pumping blood, but that's pretty much what it does. And it has a very simple structure relative to the structures of the brain. And yet, if you go into a cardiology clinic or a pediatric cardiology clinic, all these kids and all these adults pretty much have similar symptoms, right? Chest pain, they get blue and they get short of oxygen, they can't walk up, all the stuff that we're familiar with. The cluster of symptoms are kind of the same, but we do things, we do tests, we do assessments to look at what part of this cardiovascular system is compromised. And we end up coming up with dozens of distinct diseases, which is very different than psychiatry. And I know that, and again, I don't want to dump on anybody who's working on the DSM, but the bottom line is I kept saying to myself, and this is 20 years ago, all right, I know there's 86 billion neurons. And just the simple reductionist perspective of this, and the glial cells, and there's trillions of synapses. And I know that these are dynamic systems. There's multiple systems that are continually active, the production and the transportation of proteins involved in the synaptic dynamics, for example, and receptor effector coupling and uncoupling and recycling and the dynamic processes that were underway. Any which of one you could disrupt a little bit, which would cause dysfunction. So the possible routes to pathophysiology were significantly greater than the way we were sort of conceptualizing all of this stuff. And so because I was a neuroscientist and I had been studying the development of the catecholamine systems and neuroadrenergic systems, and looking at the effects of developmental disruptions of various sorts, I was very familiar with these concepts, which are really important in our field, but we never talk about them. Equifinality basically means that you can end up with attention problems, right? You can end up with the symptoms that get you the label of ADHD through thousands of routes in the brain. Similarly, you can have one disruption in a certain system at a certain time of development, and you're going to have a multifinality outcome, right? You could have lots of things that could happen depending upon other intervening factors. And so if you start to take into consideration the equifinality and the multifinality, our ability to describe the clinical phenomenology in mental health it's a daunting task. And so part of me was like, just wanted to throw up my hands and say, what the hell? I'm just going to do what everybody else does. And then part of me is like, shit, I need to try to do something different. And just in part because I'm a little bit of I'm the kind of kid who sat in the back of the class and told jokes and said that's bullshit all the time because I just didn't always believe what everybody told me. It took me a while to sort of have the courage to say, all right, let's try to create an approach and Mr. Smarty Pants, if you think you're so smart, why don't you do something different? What would you do? So this is what we did. We decided to try to put together an approach to clinical problem solving that would basically ignore the diagnoses issues. We'd try to come up with something that was basically descriptive. And it's very similar to the thinking around the development of the RDoC criterion, right? RDoC, that whole process, those of you who are familiar with it, really was the attempt to create this sort of a descriptive matrix. And again, I think in large part in response to some of the same things that we were seeing. And so basically what we decided to do was go back and take some of the things that we knew about how the brain developed, how the brain worked, and how the brain changed, and see whether or not we could identify key concepts and principles about the brain that would help us in our clinical work. That's basically what it is. And the key was we had to recognize that everything that we were doing was essentially a model, that we had to model this. And I think this is one of the most important things that we always have to keep in mind in our work, and I think other people should in their work as well, is that every time we sort of define or describe or articulate or categorize, we're essentially simplifying. We're modeling. We're creating a model. But the question is this model going to be helpful? It's going to be wrong in some way. There's no single theoretical point of perspective, no single assessment, no single measure that can conceivably capture the complex range of things about human beings. But is there something helpful in that heuristic that you can you can learn something that is true without having to find the truth, which I think is part of what we were trying to do. The second thing that was really important for us was, can we develop a heuristic model, heuristic process that was flexible enough to talk to educators about the brain, important things that they should know about how the brain works, state-dependent functioning, right? That sequential processing of information in the brain. That's a really important thing if you're an educator. If you want to learn about implicit bias, you need to know about sequential processing of information in the brain. If you want to understand PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, evocative cues, you need to understand their sequential processing in the brain. You don't need to become a neuroscientist to understand the sequential processing in the brain, but you need a useful heuristic that can make the point. At the same time, that simple heuristic, can you turn around and use it to talk to neuroscientists about, neurodevelopmental impact of dopaminergic systems and the impact that they have on the reward neurobiology in the brain? So that's kind of what we were trying to do. It was very aspirational. And if I had known what it was going to entail at that time, I probably would have retired and become a sheep farmer. But 25 years ago, I was arrogant enough and stupid enough to try to create something that would capture all these things. And we made lots and lots and lots of mistakes. But the bottom line is, this is our primary heuristic. And all of you know, of course, the brain is not an upside down beige triangle. But there are things about this heuristic that we can use to capture things that are accurate broadly. So it is generally accurate that there is a hierarchical organization to how the brain's put together. There's a bottom and there's a top. And it is generally true, generally accurate, that neural networks in the cortex are mediating more complex functions than the neural networks that are in lower parts of the brain. So there is this hierarchical organization of the brain, both in structure and function. There's increasing complexity, broadly speaking. Now, one of the more important things that this heuristic helps us remember is that the cortex, this top part of our brain, has neural networks that mediate the most uniquely human functions. And so if you look at the expression of human unique DNA, the part of our body that has the most uniquely human DNA expressed is the cortex. And of course, it's no surprise then that the most uniquely human functions are mediated by these cortical systems. So again, you can use this heuristic to talk about some important points, makes some key, communicate key issues. We went on to sort of think about this. And again, there are versions of this. Like I said, I was studying the development of these core neurotransmitter networks in the lower part of the brain. And we've been able to use this to talk to people about and to help people visualize the impact that these systems have on influencing upstream development. And so the heuristic was pretty flexible. The key addition to this heuristic that helped people begin to organize the factoids that they'd learned. And again, you are all physicians, most of you are physicians, or you're in the medical sort of focused mental health world. And almost all of you have learned lots of, or heard and learned lots of factoids about the brain. And some of you may have focused in on, oh, the amygdala is really important. I flipped my lid, I had my amygdala, had an amygdaloid rage, or whatever buzzword language you use. You've learned a few factoids about the brain. But I think one of the problems that we have at least I had when we had our neuroscience in medical school, is that we didn't get a lot of integrating and unifying exposure to the concepts and principles. We got a lot of factoids, sort of like a whole bunch of Christmas tree ornaments that were just scattered across the floor. But we didn't get the tree. And so we kind of view this heuristic as the tree that you can hang the factoids on. So let me just hang a few factoids here. If you look at the organization of these core regulatory networks, noradrenergic, serotonergic, dopaminergic. And obviously you can see this is not accurate. You know, there's a lot of these systems, but collectively we refer to them as the core regulatory network. But collectively, if you look at them, they literally reach every single part of the brain, every single other part of the brain. And both indirectly through the neuroendocrine and neuroimmune systems and directly through the autonomic nervous system, they reach every other organ in the body. So because of this architecture, our core regulatory networks play this incredibly important role in stress and regulating all of our stressors, right? Stressors related to lack of food, stressors related to lack of oxygen, stressors related to saber-toothed tigers, stressors related to being marginalized in a group. Whatever the stressor is, the mediating first step, no matter what it is, if your stressor is being excluded because you're not the right race, if you're being excluded because you're the wrong gender, you know, the prevailing perspective of the group you're engaging with, what if they're excluding you and you feel distressed by that, the first place that's going to impact your brain is down here. We don't have cortex to cortex communication. We do not telepathically connect. It has to go through this sequence of processing. And that's just the fundamental reality of how the architecture of the brain works. And the first place for all of this processing of I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I'm cold, I'm scared is through these core regulatory networks coming in through our interoceptive feedback or through our primary five senses. There's no sensory input or interoceptive input that goes to the smart part of your brain directly. Nothing. It's always, always an intermediary processing either in the lower or the middle part of the brain. And so again, this heuristic can help people learn that. Now, the irony is everybody did learn that, but nobody remembers it. Now I'll come back and we can, you know, we maybe can talk a little bit about this, but the couple things that are really important about this and is that, and let's talk about development. The brain develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. And the vast majority of brain development actually happens in utero. Most cells are born, most cells migrate to where they're supposed to go. Most sprouting of the initial connectivity starts in utero. And then there continues to be this very rapid explosive growth in the next year or so, and then there's more, and so there's a lot of brain developmental processes that are front-loaded that take place in utero in the first couple of years of life. And one of the most important roles that these core regulatory networks play in your life is guiding the differentiation and specialization and final functional organization of higher parts of the brain. So in the beginning, we think about these systems as neurotransmitter networks. And when a developing brain, that's exactly what they are. The neurotransmission is the role that they play. But in the developing brain, the role they play is as morphogens. Morphogens are essentially chemicals, you know, neurochemicals, peptides, other things that influence the differentiation of target cells. So the networks up here, the undifferentiated neurons up here that are going to be involved in forming and maintaining relationships are going to be influenced by the input from down here. This is why early developmental activity, early developmental input that shifts the activity and the reactivity of these systems has such a profound impact on subsequent development. There's a cascade effect of early developmental insults that come from in utero and in the first early months of life, because those are periods when there's exquisite and important organizational signals from the world to tell these systems how to organize. And so one of the things that I was developing, that I was studying, and many other people were studying this as well, but it was a huge part of our work, was we were looking at how the different patterns of activation of these core regulatory networks, of these stress response systems, would lead to completely different functional outputs and different neurobiological organization. So what we were finding is if we gave either chemicals or experiences that activated those systems, and the experiences were stress experiences, right? So we could give drug that activated those networks, or we could give stress experiences. But if these stress experiences became predictable for the animal and they were moderate, and the animal actually started to have control over them, could choose when I'm going to get my little shock, the animals developed tolerance to the drug and basically developed a form of resilience. Their stress response systems became more flexible and more capable of dealing with future stressors later in the animal's life. And this is exactly what happens with human beings. And then this is exactly what happens during healthy development. Healthy development involves the predictable exposure to novelty and new things that activate your stress response systems in moderate ways. And the developing child typically has elements of control, right? They can crawl out away from primary caregiver a little bit, explore the world, get a little bit anxious, and then go back. And when it gets, and they can decide how far they crawl and when they crawl, where they crawl, et cetera, et cetera. And they can control to some degree that external stress regulator by crying, right? If the external caregiver is attentive, attuned, responsive, and present, and if the infant shows distress, who comes? The regulator, the external stress regulator. So again, those of you who are into infant mental health, you know this story very well. The presence of an attentive, attuned, relational individual that will meet your fundamental needs builds resilience. That's where it comes from. In contrast, what we were finding in animal models, and this is 30 years ago, well-established research, if you actually gave the same amount of drug or the same quantity of stress and distress, but the animal had no control over it and it was unpredictably given, and instead of in tiny little moderate predictable doses, it came in these extreme or prolonged ways, the animal literally, the same systems that make you strong make you weak, make you vulnerable, and the vulnerability is expressed as a change in the stress reactivity curve. So if you have a daily challenge, we have these internal apparatuses, I've kind of talked about them, that help us deal with stress, right? These internal capabilities that help us deal with, oh, I have to give a talk and I'm a little bit anxious, but I can handle that. Hopefully it's a moderate stress, but it's controllable. If I actually prepare, then it's not going to be as overwhelming as if I'm like mail it in and go, oh, what the hell, I just show up. Then it's a lot more stressful. So if you have prepared, it's a moderate stressor and I can stay in an active alert state. And as I'll show in a minute, I can still have access to big parts of my cortex. If you have a sensitized stress response system, though, because you are very, very anxious, you don't do well in groups, you're nervous about your data, whatever, you have the moderate stressor. To you and I, most of us have given a presentation, but to a person who has a sensitized stress response, who has social phobia, if they get up in front of a group, they literally feel afraid. I mean, they have the same response as if they're under life-threatening threat. And again, this sensitized stress response is the product of a pattern of activation of these core regulatory networks, which under active threat, in comes the external threat, right? You'll activate the locus coeruleus and other systems that will recruit the amygdala and then these other frontal cortical systems that everybody reads about. Now the other part that's equally important is that when you are under threat and under stress, not only do you recruit systems to help you, activate them, get them going, you shut down systems that aren't going to help you in that moment. And so by and large, the general sort of rule of thumb, if you will, is that the more threatened you are, the more you feel threatened, the more you shut down cortical systems. So there's a top down, you shut down like this. So when you're calm and regulated, You've got all kinds of top parts of your brain open for business. If you have a sensitized stress response system and you've literally had lots of extreme, unpredictable, prolonged stress, this is your baseline. And so if you're a kid who's going into a pre-K environment and half of the spoken language to you is inefficiently transferred up to the cortex because you have your cortex shut down from having a sensitized stress response system, you start to fall behind cognitively. And then this is why these early developmental experiences here and here that shape these core regulatory networks, which will then influence the development of these higher parts of the brain. This is why intrauterine and early developmental experiences are so important in influencing not only the organization and functioning of the brain, but also the organization and functioning of the rest of the body. So those of you who are familiar with and follow the ACE literature, that's what that's all about. You remember that this core regulatory network heuristic, these systems are also going out to the heart, lung, the gut, influencing your immune system, influencing your neuroendocrine functioning. And so if you get sensitized, overactive, overly reactive responses up here, you're going to get overactive, overly reactive responses here. And you're going to have a higher probability of having a higher resting heart rate, having hypertension, having asthma, having autoimmune diseases, having all kinds of other things. And of course, if you look at the epidemiological data, that's what that says. That's what that's all about. And this is kind of the mechanism. Now, it's likely not the only mechanism, but it's one of the major mechanisms. So here's what we know. If there are disruptors of our core regulatory network, there will predictably be increased risk across the board. And these predictable things are intrauterine insults that we've all seen. You know, you can have stress, distress of the mother, malnutrition, methamphetamine, prenatal alcohol. I mentioned it earlier, I didn't go into it, but the early life experience of having a present, attentive, attuned, responsive caregiver is helping you build in predictable, moderate, controllable experiences with stress. It's helping build resilience. But if you have disruptions of your bonding and attachment early in life because of domestic violence or an isolated mother or a depressed mother, that will predictably lead to dysregulation of those core regulatory networks, lead to that cascade of risk I'm talking about. And then, and this is a very important part, any sensitizing pattern of stress activation can lead to that physiology. It doesn't have to be a natural disaster. It doesn't have to be war. It could be being the wrong sort of race in a dominant culture. It could be being excluded. And it doesn't have to necessarily be race. It could be other things. Some kids are bullied and they develop a sensitized stress response system, increases their vulnerability for depression, for suicide, for vulnerability to use substances to regulate and reward themselves. So all of these things are also potentially capable of creating this sensitized response. Now, that's a little bit of the background stuff that we were bringing into all of our work, and part of what the issue was, all right, so what? Like, what do you do with that? So part of what we recognized was that our current problem-solving process was not getting us where we wanted to be with really capturing these developmental histories. It wasn't helping us describe the unique clinical phenomenology of the individual. And we recognize that, this part of the dilemma we have in medicine and in psychiatry is that everybody really is unique. Everybody is a unique person. And yet at the same time, there's this push for us to categorize people and fit them into a box. And I see the value of that, of course. But part of what we were trying to struggle with is, how do you create a systematic way to get information so you can ask and answer big questions at the same time that you value the uniqueness of the individual and their family and their culture and their community. How do you do that? And we struggled. We still are struggling, but we kind of have come up with an approach that tries to do that. And so one of the things that we developed was this assessment process that helped us make decisions about how to select and sequence therapeutic activities. And a key part of what we did was that we recognized that, and again, this is something that I had to learn about because of the research I was doing. I recognized that the numbers of subjects that were going to be required to do this was in excess of 100,000. And as all of you know, I don't know if any of you ever read, I've never read in our literature in child and adolescent psychiatry any study that has an N over 100,000. And so I'm like, how are we going to get an N of 100,000? So here's what we did. We basically said, we're going to develop a semi-structured, standardized assessment process. We're going to try to get people to use it. Hopefully people will use it because it helps them, because that's one of the big things. You can't get people in child welfare, education, mental health, particularly if these are public system, public systems. If the assessment you're asking them to do is not helpful, they won't do it. And they'll just be garbage in, garbage out. So we intentionally created an assessment process that we felt would be have one toe in research acceptable and one toe in clinical practical application. And let me tell you kind of what we did. Part of what we did was try to decide, well, what do we measure? What should we systematically try to measure? What should we measure? Height? Should we measure weight? What are the things that really count? And so we had some ideas. We knew that there was a significantly important and need to measure adversity. We knew this. We'd worked with the ACE folks, and we'd done a lot of this other work with early developmental insults and the development of function and development of the brain. So we wanted to measure adversities. But we also knew that the ACE studies really were taking a 50,000-foot flyover, and they were only looking at like the presence of something over an 18-year period. And so we knew that we had to look at the timing of adversities as well as the kind of adversities. So we wanted to look at the timing and the nature of adversities, but we also knew from our work, and this is from some of our work, that if you look at the relationship between developmental adversities and bad outcomes, mental health, suicide, divorce, unemployment, all that kind of stuff, that there was this curve. But from our work, we knew that if you had adversities, but you had connectedness, if you were connected in a healthy way to family, community, and culture, your risk was decreased. And furthermore, if you were disconnected, if you were not connected to family, community, and culture in healthy ways, you were at risk for these bad outcomes, even in the absence of these 10 conventional adversities. So we developed an assessment process that looked at the nature and the timing of developmental adversities. We made it a web-based assessment, and then we created a heuristic to look at, basically to reconstruct the individual's, and again, this is a heuristic. We looked at how are we going to create a picture of that individual's brain? And we decided to essentially use our primary heuristic and ask clinicians questions about autonomic functioning. And depending upon the responses, we would score. Are they undeveloped or severely dysfunctional, or are these functionals developed and adult-like? And so when you look at a newborn's brainstem functioning is not adult-like, but it's emerging. You have some fundamental capabilities to breathe and to crudely regulate body temperature. And you've got a cortex, but it's not organized yet to do all these adult functions. So that's undeveloped. And so we went through it as different ages have different functional capabilities. And we had developed the estimate of the normative organization of the brain. And then we started to look at individuals who were presenting to us clinically. And so here's a 9-year-old, and here's what a typical 8 to 10-year-old looks like. And you're not used to seeing these, but what you can tell is that anything that's red is significantly abnormal or undeveloped. And then based upon this map, we put together and sequence a set of educational, therapeutic, and enrichment activities that will plausibly provide the kinds of organizing input initially for the lower part of the brain, and then when that gets better, for the middle part of the brain, and so forth. And so we use this report, this clinical assessment, to help guide our clinical treatment planning. And this is an example of that in application with a 9-year-old child. Now, the year prior to this child had been in a conventional placement, had been going to get TFCBT every week for 50 weeks, made no progress. This child came in we had this assessment, and the recommendations were not about working on speech and language and self-esteem and other things that were a problem. We need to work on fundamental sensory integration. And once that got a little bit better, we would do things that would help, that were fundamentally regulatory, a lot of somatosensory stuff. And then once that got better, then we would start talking and using more conventional play and insight-oriented and cognitive therapeutic approaches. But the idea is that you sequence the set of assessments in a way that is going to target the lowest, most disorganized part of the brain. Now, I could go on and on about this, but I know I'm running out of time. What I want to say is that we've been very, very surprised at kind of the tremendous growth of this model. We haven't really been trying to push it out there. Like we're not really advertising it. In the beginning, I was, just talking to people about what we did. And then I had a couple of unfortunate incidents where people, they'd hear me give 1 grand rounds, and then they'd go, oh, I'm going to go do the neurosequential model. And then they would do stuff like give everybody a massage. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. So we decided we had to start a certification process to ensure that people using this tool and using this approach had been exposed to the core content that we wanted. And then we limited access of this tool to people who were trained. And since then, we've manualized a lot of different versions of this, one that's targeted for educators, one that's for caregivers, one that we've been using in sport. And we now have an N of over 100,000, which has allowed us to ask and answer some really interesting questions about developmental adversity. And these, of course, are very preliminary. There's more to do, but a couple of things that we've been able to see, for example, is that your history of connectedness, in other words, the kids that had low relational health, but didn't have high adversity, they did as poorly as the kids that had high adversity and reasonable or moderate or acceptable relational health. And again, I think this is a very important thing, because policy-wise, all across the United States, in these trauma-informed initiatives, people have been thinking that they can check the box by just doing an ACE study, or ACE inventory, which is incomplete, in my opinion. Now, the other thing that we found that is very interesting to me is that reinforce kind of what I was saying earlier, is that early developmental experiences have disproportionate impact on development. And we've found, and I'm trying to find the right slide here, but one of the things that we have found that I think is most compelling, and I'm on it, might not even have it in here, is that, oh, here it is. We have when we look at the adversity and the connectedness measure, if you have high adversity and low connection, low relational health, that's high developmental risk. In contrast, if you've just got sort of moderate adversity and moderate connection, you get a lower developmental risk score. You're not no risk, but you have lower risk. And so we have this huge data set, and we were able to collect a large group of individuals who had high adversity in their first 2 months of life. They had high and low relational health. In other words, they had significant, well, actually, oops, let me explain this the right way. Sorry. Erase all that. Don't erase all that. Just, I forgot the way the slide goes. So if you have individuals who have low adversity at birth, and then they stay in that low adversity environment up until age 13, and you look at how their brain is organized, we have a way to add up all of the functional capabilities of all these different parts of the brain. These kids are about 70% of what you would expect from a child who had no adversity. And if you take it, similarly, take a group that had high adversity all through life, these are the kids that end up literally at age 13, they're in special education. They've typically been kicked out of school. They're 2 grade levels behind. These are the most struggling kids, the most diagnoses, the most medications. These are really challenging children. If you now take a group of kids that had high adversity in the high developmental risk in the first 2 months of life, but then were removed and put into our foster care or adoptive care systems, and for the next 12 years really didn't have any bad things happen. They had some, but not very high adversity. Their outcomes were as bad as kids that were in the high adversity environment the whole time. And again, most of you know this, right? A lot of you work with kids that are in foster care, who've been adopted, who had really bad starts, who are still struggling. They still have they still have lots of problems. Here's the good news. The good news is if you have a low risk group, not a no risk, but a low risk group, and then the wheels fall off that family, whatever supports you had to provide stable housing and consistency and safety for the young parents, that goes away. And for the next 12 years, they have high risk. Their outcomes of these kids are as good as if these kids were in the low risk environment the whole time. This is a really strong argument for high quality early intervention programs, home visiting programs, and so forth. Now, I could go on and talk about a lot of this stuff forever. You probably can see that I actually have, I have a lot of stuff, including neuroimaging that we've been doing to basically show the high correlation between the metric scores and neuroimaging scores, but that's too much. I don't want to push my time too much. Let me go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to come back and say hi. I know that this is, I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions or thoughts or comments that people have. And thank you for your attention, first of all.
If anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, by all means, or you can type in the chat. Just a reminder for trainees, for fellows and psych interns, et cetera, there's some extra copies of What Happened to You available in the present area. So please feel free to unmute if you have a question.
I did have a question, but I just wanted to share with you just ever so briefly. I listened to the audiobook while I was driving back to Montana this summer, and going over Monada Pass just had such an epiphany from some of what you were talking about. And I'm just so grateful that you did all this, grateful that you're here. So I just really appreciate that. I wished
Thank you.
every time a patient has said, "What's happening to me?" I've always struggled with that answer, right? Like, how do I cram the body of neuroscience into like that answer? And I do a lot of hand waving, and so the upside down triangle I think is very useful, and I've definitely rolled that out to good effect.
Thank you. Yeah,
I guess
I have to say that the psychoeducational value of that image has been tremendously helpful for if people feel a little less stigmatized and more empowered, because you can say, listen, this is not working well right down here, but we can change that. There are things that we know how that, if we do these kinds of things, that helps those systems change. So it tends to be a pretty hopeful approach.
Well, and I think that that was my question. So I just finished child fellowship. This is my first attending gig. It's been going well. I'm happy, but it's starting to dawn on me that when we have a 16-year-old with a new first suicide attempt, it feels like we're 15 and a half years too late, right?
Yeah.
It feels like the train has left the station, and a lot of things that happened that sometimes it feels like we were not going to reverse. And obviously I love child for the hopeful component. I ran away from geriatric psychiatry because I didn't feel that way. No offense. But how do we put that hope back realistically? Like what are the outcomes we can expect when that, because I saw a lot of scary stuff in that last graph, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I always am a little hesitant to show that because people do get discouraged. What I want to, we have, first of all, here's what I want to say. What we've learned is that every single system in the brain, even the lowest systems in the brainstem, are capable of changing, and they're malleable if we follow the rules of neuroplasticity. And this is one of the big issues where we run into in psychiatry. The lower parts of the brain are responsive to pattern repetitive movement, pattern repetitive sound, pattern repetitive, all kinds of stuff that we don't usually incorporate in traditional sit in my office and let's talk psychotherapy. And I'm not being critical of that approach, but I think part of what we've learned to do is to say, listen, we'll focus on your self-esteem after we help you develop regulatory capabilities. And because if we don't focus on the regulation and help you get a little bit better at that, you're going to go out and add to your catalog of failed social interactions and failed academic interactions and failed work interactions. So you can build self-esteem when you have success in real life experiences. So let's help you get better at that. And so that's the good news. We actually have had tremendously positive outcomes with adults who have had really definite, terrible early developmental histories, tend to be very impulsive, have very bad sort of what we call relational sensitivity. It's sort of like relational intimacy is an evocative cue. So they sabotage all their relationships. And so when you talk, we do a lot of psychoeducation, and we do a lot of sort of co-treatment planning with the client. And I have to say and again, I don't like to be too optimistic, but the outcomes we get are pretty good. We've seen kids in places like we have schools that have had 500 referrals to principal a month go to none. And these are like the kids that got kicked out of every other school, got sent to, this special school, and they get a developmentally targeted treatment plan. And when that happens, you start to have these little successes, and it creates a climate of regulation that's just leads to healing, and sometimes pretty quickly. So we are actually very much more optimistic than I used to be. 20 years ago when we were doing this work, I was like, geez, and it's because in the beginning of my career, I was focused on what happens when you disrupt the developing brain. And I'm like, wow, this sucks. This is bad. I was getting kids that were locked in closets, and I'd see small brains, and I'd see and I'm like, wow, that's what happens. But after about 15 years, we started thinking, as we were trying to decide how do we try to develop interventions to help people, we would see progress that was like, in the beginning, I didn't believe it. We would see kids that were severely neglected, that were 4, 5, 6 years in kind of institutional settings, had IQs of 60, 65, impulsive, aggressive, self-mutilatory. And we do one of these metrics, and we kind of figure out, well, talking to this kid's not going to get us anywhere. So let's just start with some basic somatosensory stuff. And 2 years later, these kids would test and have IQs of 85. 4 years later, they have IQs of 100. And it was like one of those things that sort of the mythology about IQ is it's a stable thing, right? But I think in some cases, when there's undeveloped raw material, if we institutionalized that kid and kept them in those settings, his IQ would stay at 60. But if you help them get regulated and start to offer them a more enriched environment, then kind of that neuroplasticity kicks in and you can see progress. So we're a little bit more optimistic than we used to be about 20 years ago. So, and let me just say one thing here. For any of you who want to learn how to do this, I'm happy. We have a couple of training programs that are using NMT and are bringing the training of this exposure to it into their residency programs. And we do that. We're happy to do that and help support that. We have a couple of partners that are directors of training programs. One's at University of South Carolina in Greenville, and she's a wonderful person. And it's always hard to bring more content into any training program. But if you have some curiosity about this, we're happy to let you all dip your toe in and get exposed to some of this stuff in a way that might be of interest to you.
That was sort of my question. I'm actually virtual faculty, and I'm in Montana, in Billings, Montana, and there is an occupational therapist who has a team of people who are using your model, and it's been my exposure and very interesting work. What is your plan to increase exposure and access, right? Is my question.
Yeah, well, we've, I don't know if I showed, we've got we think the long-term strategy is to slowly back this into training programs, at least the concepts, and, let people exposed to it. So we have several schools of social work where they have a special track where their social workers learn NMT. And we do that for free. We don't, at schools of education, we have a school of University of Colorado, Denver Department of Psychology, educational psychologists that are training, are learning the neurosequential model in education. And so we're doing this with Purdue Northwest in Indiana, and they're integrating this into their school of education, psychology, and so forth. So the long-term wish is that rather than learning about this stuff in a postgraduate way, which is kind of crazy, right? We have all of these postgraduate things. Oh, let's learn about trauma in the brain. And it really should be integrated in earlier in our training. And so we've got people that are working on that for medical education. We have people that are bringing some of this stuff into some residency programs, and so that's kind of what we're doing. Part of my dilemma is that I am not an implementation scientist, and I'm not the kind of person that's likes to push things on people. So what I learned early on, that if you knock on the door and say, hey, I know all about the brain and all about trauma, and you should know that too, that does not work very well. So we've taken, I don't want to say passive, but we're trying to let the work speak for itself. We're very happy with the slow growth. We're very happy. We are kind of always self-correcting, thinking of better ways to teach, and recognizing that what we thought was a good idea in the beginning isn't. But we're actually pretty far down the line now with the initial certification process with NMT, and we feel very comfortable sharing that and bringing that into training programs. And so that's kind of what we're doing. We actually have, there's like, I think we're in like, last time I checked, something like 26 countries or something. People are using this model. The state of California is, is in reinventing their child mental health systems. Of course, they do that every 5 years. I didn't want to point that out to them. It's like, I was involved in that, the reinvention 20 years ago. Like, you're back at it. Good for you. Anyway, but they have a lot of counties that want to bring this model in, and at the state level, they want to support this as kind of the clinical framework, because it really is a framework. It's not intended to exclude other ways of thinking about or doing work. It's just it's got a useful organizing capability, in part because of the web-based assessment that can travel. And but I'm kind of rambling. Sorry. I know I've pushed past time. I apologize.
We're happy to have that extra time. We do appreciate the time today, and I think that's a good place to kind of get moving on with the rest of the day. And thank you so much for a really insightful and wonderful talk. So
thank you so much. I appreciate it. Keep up the good work. And Blake, if you want to do this, let me know. We'll get you signed up.
Oh yeah, you're not gonna get rid of me, Dr. Perry. I'll be around.
All right. See you guys.
So.